Welcome to the May 19th update of the IHME COVID-19 forecasting model. My name is Alan Featherstone. This is work that's done in conjunction with Julia Maddock and Jonathan Featherstone. Again, the virus is continuing to have a major effect on the economy, with the unemployment rate probably closing in on 20% or a little bit over 20%. Since the middle of March, roughly 36 million U.S. workers have filed for unemployment due to the shutdown of a significant share of the economy. Certainly the supply chains have changed drastically, moving from a strong consumption of food away from home to at home. And roughly pre-COVID, about 55% of the food was consumed away from home. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington certainly has played a large role in the formation of policy. The data used in this analysis is sourced from the www.healthdata.org, and then the actual deaths that we use in this analysis is from the COVID tracking project. It's really important to understand the performance of this model and the periodic revisions that are made to the model and whether or not those revisions are accurate or not. This is an update of the May 12th discussion, and the last major change in the modeling approach occurred with the May 4th update. Since then, there's been several updates, but those are more minor with regards to the U.S. What we're going to look at in this session is we want to look at the revisions since May 12th. We want to look at the stability of the IHME forecast since the inception of the model. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at Kansas mortality statistics. Again, I think one of the important things to realize is that this is an opportunity to educate about risk. And in some respects, this is a unique event where risk is uncertain. And so it's really interesting to look at changes in human behavior. We're going to look at where we are in terms of that March 26 model. That was the original model that certainly led to a lot of shutdowns and policies within different states. But then we're going to also go ahead and look at some of the cumulative statistics with regards to the March 26 model and then the May 4th model. And so with the substantial change in the modeling approach that occurred with the release of the May 4th model, it's important to begin to track how that model's performing. And then there's also, in some states, more than 2 weeks of evidence with relaxed stay-at-home orders. And so we want to look and see whether or not the distributions change there. What I've done, and you can certainly look at previous analysis to get a little bit more detail on the models. I'm going to maybe jump ahead and just kind of get to the results in this session. And essentially what I'm doing is just looking at 3 out of the last 4 model releases and compare that to the original release on March 29th. And so looking at this, the purple line is the original model in March 29th. In terms of essentially, if we look at this, essentially forecasts start here for the model in blue. In terms of the model in red, it's kind of roughly the same place. And then the model in green looks at that. And so all the choppy data in terms of the green and on top of the red line our earlier forecasts. And so this does give a little bit of indication, but essentially on the daily death distribution, we went from there to there, then we went up to the red line in Kansas, and then we went down to the green line. And so that's the most recent forecast essentially from here forward with respects to the daily expected death distribution for the state of Kansas. We can then look at it from a cumulative perspective, and the first model basically was just shy of 700 deaths in Kansas. In terms of the last revisions, in terms of it was revised down with the May 4th model to about 260, 270. Then it jumped up to over 400 in the May 8th revision, and then the most recent revision, it has fallen again to about 325. And so again, you can see that there is a lot of different aspects here. And again, if you want to see all the different models, you can look at some of the previous aspects. To give an indication of the original model compared to the 4th, the 11th, and the 18th release, in terms of we can look at things. For example, California, the expected deaths are increasing. In terms of Connecticut, they're increasing. In terms of other states, for example, Maine, they're all down about 97% of what was originally expected. And you can begin to look at this in terms of Alabama. The 5-4 model predicted an increase, but then Alabama has basically moved more negative, indicating that the deaths are going down. Conversely, Arizona is the other way. Again, you can kind of look at these. The numbers in red basically are less deaths being forecasted. Missouri kind of was 17 up to 88, down to 43. Massachusetts up to 402, and so you can see that there is quite a bit of difference from different types of models in terms of where we were. North Carolina was negative 32%, and now it's up to 46.7, and so the prediction of death in North Carolina has increased over the last 2 weeks. Conversely, same type of thing in North Dakota in terms of from negative 77% to negative 22%. And so, again, you can look at this. Utah, in terms of, again, forecasted more deaths here. But you can see these numbers. The U.S. as a whole, in some respects, increase of 64%, 67% from the original model to May 11th, and then May 18th continues to rise. And we can take a look at this in terms of the original model was close to 80,000. And if you look at the 5.1 release, it was in excess of 130. The 5.8 was a little bit higher. And then the most recent model, which was released yesterday, is now over 140,000. Again, New York, you can kind of look at that in terms of the original model was 15,000. Essentially, the more recent models are up over 32, 33,000. And in some respects, when the major shift in modeling occurred, there hasn't been a big change with regards to what's going on. California, in terms of that, has the original model and then the May 4th, but as the models go on, essentially the expected deaths have continued to increase such that by August 4th of this year, it'll be, or is expected according to the models, to be up with regards to close to 7,000. Florida, in some respects, it's a little bit different situation in terms of huge drop, then an increase, and then a decrease. And so we're looking at essentially 4,800 with regards to the projection. Florida is somewhat important because they have released some of the restrictions, and so their economy is opening a little bit quicker. And so it'll really be interesting to begin tracking this with regards to the actual data. Illinois, in terms of essentially as the models have been released, the last 3 models, essentially the levels of death are expected to increase in each revision. Texas, in some respects, dropped to the blue, to the red, and back up to the green. And it's interesting that the May 1st and May 17th model are very much on top of each other. The next thing we're going to look is just at the daily death over time in terms of one of the things to realize is that Kansas now is doing a different reporting system, and Kansas is only reporting 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And so over the weekend you have 3 days cumulative, and so basically there is no report there, no report there. And so essentially these are 2 days, these are 3 days with regards to observations. And again, that just makes the modeling process more complex when information isn't provided on a regular basis. Again, in terms of looking at this, you can see that essentially Kansas has been relatively flat the entire time. Again, if you would average those out, you would probably see a downward trend in the death over time. Generally, we've been outside that 95% confidence interval. We've been lower than the lower bound. And if you would look at a probability perspective, when this model was put together, basically the probability of being below the green line would be 2.5%. And so, again, looking at what's occurred in Kansas has been not near what the projections had suggested. I've updated these numbers in the last week in terms of, again, I think it's important to have an understanding of the distribution of the mortality of COVID versus the 2018 mortality rates, again, which are the most recent numbers that are available. In terms of this adds to 95.8% simply because there's a 4.2% chance of death if you're under 35. But if you look at these numbers in some respects, they're pretty close with regards to this. You do see a little bit of higher mortality in that 55 to 64 range than expected, and then the 85 plus range. A little less, probably not statistically significant, any of these differences, but in some respects, those individuals that normally would have high mortality rates end up having high mortality rates under the coronavirus. The other way of looking at this is essentially looking at the death per 1,000. Again, 6.3 individuals per 1,000 die before year 1. 1.2 per 1,000 die between 1 and 24. All the way up to 142.1 out of 1,000 die if they're 85% or 85 years or more. If you look at the distribution per 1,000, you can kind of back out what the distribution is. But again, so far in Kansas, and this has been roughly a 2-month period, if you wanted to, you could multiply each of these numbers by 6. But essentially, you can see that the deaths per 1,000 from the coronavirus are substantially less than the mortality rate as the state as a whole. And so even though the distribution follows the normal distribution, so far in terms of if you take 1 divided by 42 or 0.29 divided by 47, you can see that there's a lot of chances of death other than coronavirus. And so if you look at it on 1,000 people, if you're 85 years plus, there's a 1 out of 1,000 chance of dying at least in the last 2 months from COVID-19. Looking at the original March 26 model and looking at the U.S. numbers, you can end up seeing that in some respects, since about the 1st of April or the 7th of April, the number of deaths have been relatively flat. There is maybe some evidence that there's beginning to be a downward trend, but again, from time to time. And again, if you follow the news, certainly there's a lot of concern with regards to the counting of death. New York, again, very much of a downward trend, except a big report of death around the 1st of May, and again, just a difference of counting. If you look at Illinois, the trend is going the other way in terms of all the way through this. Certainly there's ups and downs, and you would hope maybe that this would be a trend here. But if you would put a trend line in since the middle of April, certainly it's been up. Michigan, certainly the trend line is going down in terms of essentially since about the 3rd week of April. California, in some respects, has been slightly down since then. Again, it does seem to be following the distribution a little bit, normally on the low side, but over the last week or two, it's a little bit above. Florida, again, looking at that, you would probably put a trend line in there. Less than that, but again, much less than the original predictions. The other thing is that they kind of opened up somewhere about the 1st of May, maybe in this rate. Certainly there's going to be a lag of a week or two with regards to acquiring the disease and then leading that to the untimely or unfortunate aspect of death. But certainly it does not appear that there's been a big resurgence in Florida. In terms of Texas, Texas also kind of opened probably about the 1st of May. And again, certainly there, if you would look at that, there hasn't been a big uptick in Texas. You probably don't see the downtick like you see in Florida. The other state we're looking at is Georgia. And again, looking at this since the opening, again, it seems to be fairly level, maybe a little bit of a downturn. Again, you can look at, in some respects, Georgia's been pretty flat all the way since about the 1st week of April. And so the next thing we'll end up doing is essentially looking at the cumulative death information. And this is going to look at the original model since March 29th. And then we're going to look at the original model with the May 4th since May 1. And so essentially we'll do that and then a little bit to kind of show the difference there. And I think once we start going over there, it'll be somewhat clear of what we're looking at. And then we'll jump through the states. This is the cumulative death total with regards to the original prediction. The original prediction was right at this 80,000 mark. We have surpassed the 80,000 mark according to the COVID-19 tracking progress. And so it does give you an indication of where we are. In terms of looking at this, the most model that kind of changed the methodology that was released on May 4th, one of the things you'll end up seeing is that is over-predicting what we're seeing in the U.S. And so, again, we are over-predicting there. In some respects, the original model under-predicted, but the more recent model, the May 4th model release, in terms of looking at that, we've been consistently under what that prediction has been. Kansas, from the entire time, again, we're quite a bit under the bound, the lower bound. And so if you look at the difference there, we're well over 400 deaths less than was originally expected. In terms of more recently, with the newer model, we're tracking much closer as you would expect. But again, you can see that the red line is a little bit below the orange line. And so the May 4th prediction is a little bit higher than the rate of death that we've been experiencing. We'll jump around Kansas and then we'll just look at these. This is the Colorado picture, again, well below the lower bound that was originally projected. In the more recent projection, looking at the numbers from May 1, you will see that Colorado is experiencing a little bit higher death rate than was projected in the model. Nebraska has been kind of on that lower bound and been below that lower bound for about the last 15 days. Looking at the orange line, again, this is the most recent methodology being used. Again, Nebraska is quite a bit lower than that recent model. Missouri had been pretty close to the original March 26th model, and since the May 4th model was released, they're a little bit higher. And in Oklahoma, again, well outside the bounds, and so their experiences has been much more positive or less negative than what was originally predicted. And since the new model was released, they continue to experience less difficulties than what was predicted. And so, again, you can see that some states are above that line, some are below. From now on, I'm just going to look at these from a regional perspective. New York is quite a bit less than the most recent projection, that orange line. New Jersey is quite a bit less than the May 4th forecast. Connecticut is pretty close to that line, but again, you can see just how much above they were from those original predictions. Massachusetts is a little bit better than the May 4th projection. Maryland, a little bit worse in terms of they've experienced a death at a little higher rate than what the May 4th model predicted. And again, that purple line and those green lines kind of give you the original model predictions. Delaware is fairly close, a little bit less in terms of mortality rate. Rhode Island is on the other side in terms of Rhode Island is experiencing a higher rate of death since the release of the May 4th. And so that model is under predicting for Rhode Island. It's also under predicting for New Hampshire. Again, looking at the difference there. And again, if you look at the original model, just a large under prediction for New Hampshire. In terms of Vermont is right on. You can see that the May 4th model does project a more favorable situation than the original model, and it looks like the actual information is tracking that fairly well. Maine, essentially so much better than the original prediction, and if you look at the May 4th model, the actual is kind of right on top of it. You can kind of see a little bit of a red there, but it's tracking very closely. Pennsylvania, the May 4th release is over-predicting the amount of death in terms of the actual numbers have been a little bit better. Same in Ohio, in terms of the actual outcomes have been a little bit better. Michigan, the actual outcomes have been a little bit better, but again, you can see the kind of the difference there with regards to the original predictions of a little less than 3,000, the actual approaching 5,000, and then the prediction as of May 4th about 5,700. Indiana, again, is doing better than the most recent model. It's essentially getting a fairly distinct difference there from that model. Illinois is pretty much on in terms of that model appears to be tracking very closely what's going on in Illinois. Iowa, again, a little bit below, but again, for the first 14, 15 days of this model, it has tracked fairly closely to the May 4th release. Minnesota is experiencing a lower mortality rate than what the model predicted, and again, you can see that Minnesota has under predicted or under had less death than what the model has predicted on both these models. Wisconsin's following it pretty closely. Florida, again, this is kind of one of the states that opened up early, very close to the May 4th predictions. Georgia is less, and so again, looking at this for the couple weeks that Georgia has released or relaxed some of the stay-at-home orders, essentially you can see that again they're experiencing a position where they're having less death than predicted by the model, and you can also compare that to the original. South Carolina, in terms of same type of thing, North Carolina experiencing better than the model predicted. Virginia is fairly close to both models. You look at the original model and you look at the orange, the actual experience has been between those two models' predictions. West Virginia, well under the original predictions, but very close to what the model has predicted 2 weeks ago. Kentucky, again, under both the original and that more recent. Tennessee, another state that's relaxed, again, very close to what the May 4th model predicted, but certainly not a situation where the states have changed drastically or the death rate. Here we have Alabama very close, Mississippi a little bit above the most recent model, Louisiana very close to those model projections. Arkansas is very close to the most recent projections. Texas, another state that had relaxed, again, they're coming under the May 4th projections. We look at New Mexico, pretty close, a little bit above. Arizona has increased above that May 4th model predictions. Utah, very close. Wyoming, very close. Montana, very close. North Dakota is a little bit better, or a little bit more death than what was predicted on May 4th. In terms of South Dakota, very close to being on that May 4th projection curve. Idaho is below. Nevada is a little bit below. California is very close to that May 4th prediction model. Oregon is a little bit under. Washington is a little bit under. And then we'll finish it up with Alaska. Alaska is a little bit above, but it is important to realize that there are such low numbers in Alaska. And again, the forecasts are so much below what was originally expected. Hawaii also is very close, and again, very low levels of death compared to what was originally projected. So with that, hopefully this gives a useful update in terms of we are taking a look at some of those states that began relaxing restrictions earlier. And so Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, I think one of the things to think about is there have not had a big uptick in the amount of death. And so in some respects, they're continuing along that May 4th projection, or perhaps doing a little bit better. And so the analysis indicates that those states have not seen a large increase in deaths. The other thing I think that is important is that the graphical analysis indicates that the model revision at the 1st of May is generally a little bit more accurate, although there are states that over and under predict. One of the things I think we'll do next time is actually look at calculating some statistical out-of-sample forecast models by the number of days. In terms of looking at that, if you look at the agmanager.info, there is a lot of slides that we don't cover, and so if you want to study more in depth with a complete set of slides, both the distribution of the original daily death and then basically looking at the cumulative death since origination, those slides are available on agmanager.info. And so if you would like to get more in-depth knowledge of a particular state that you might have an interest in, that information is there. And so hopefully this has been an interesting update with regards to where we are. Again, in some respects, the models and the actual deaths are going to drive the opening of the economy. The other thing I think that's very important to look at is to begin to see whether or not there would be kind of increased infections occurring in certain states. And so certainly kind of looking at this information over time will be beneficial as we move forward. And so with that, have a good week. We will be back next week to take another look at what we're experiencing with the coronavirus.